Also, now I can't say anything scandalous.
That shouldn't stop you. It has never stopped you before. Might as well go for it.
Go on record.
I think let's get started, maybe. Got plenty of people.
Sure. Alrighty, so good evening, morning to those joining us from different parts of the world. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Marine Suleiman. I'm the co-director for CCIT, and I hereby welcome you to the 9th session of our MEDJACK webinar series. These webinars are held every fortnight, and the main purpose of these webinars is to have a conversation around MEDJACK and ICE, innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship, and a chance to share your personal journey around innovation and beyond. MEDJACK, being AKU's first ever digital book, has been co-authored by a total of 14 co-authors. And today we have with us, let me count, 1, 2, 3. I can count 3 co-authors here with us on the panel. I'll quickly introduce you to our moderator for today's session, which will be Dr. Asad Mia, Chairman of Emergency Department and the Director for CCIT. Hi, Asad. How are you?
Good.
I'll move on and quickly introduce our other panelists for today's discussion. We have with us Dr. Walid Farooqi, who graduated from AKU MBBS class of 2016. He served as the co-director for CCIT from 2016 to 2019 and currently is working as a research manager for Emergency Department, Weill Cornell Medicine. Hi, Walid. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our speaker for today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
We'll just get you involved in the chat. I'll quickly introduce our other panelist for today, Ms. Farhana Alarakhiya, Chief Data Innovation Officer, AKU, previously at Shopify, IBM Watson, Cognos, SAS. Hi, Farhana. So good to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad you didn't say what my graduating class was.
I was strategic about it. So I welcome you all to our MEDJACK webinar series. And before I hand over the mic to Asad, few housekeeping rules. So for this webinar, we'll be following our usual format. It will be an interactive session towards the end. If you have a comment or a question, please feel free to write it in the chat box. And I think you have an option of raising your hand and we'll address your question. So over to you, Asad.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. All right. So thank you, Walid and Farhana. We're really, really happy and excited that you have made the time and you're both joining us from North America. So for us, it's end of the day and you're starting your day. So hopefully it's a good start to your day. So before, what we've typically done in these webinars is that I tend to spend a few minutes talking to people about the book, it's kind of giving an overview. I don't delve into details as to why we went about writing the book, but just to kind of give, and every webinar session we've had a different set of people. And so being cognizant of that, I think it just ends up being a good idea, in my opinion, that the newer folks get to see where is this book coming from, what's the content, and so on and so forth. So I know that I'll be belaboring the point for you both, but if you could bear with me, I'm just going to take, and Walid loves my PowerPoint presentation, so how can I have this session without my slides? So on popular demand, especially Walid's, here I go with my slides. And okay, can you see this? Can you see these slides? All right, okay. So this book, it's called MEDJACK, The Extraordinary Journey of an Ordinary Hack. And it's just really simplified. It's a book about ways of hacking healthcare and other problems to create low-cost sustainable solutions. And I'm not going to give you details as to what kinds of problems, what were the problems that were identified, and how did we go about solving those problems, because it'll give away a lot of the content as well. But if you're interested, please do get hold of the book. There's a digital book, Marine mentioned. It's available on Amazon for your free Kindle e-reader. It's also available on Kobo. And very recently, just a few weeks back, we have released the print copy. And the simplest way of getting the print copy would be from Pakistan. So if you're traveling this way, then just get a hold of us, and then we'll be happy to get you the book, the actual print copy. It's been a fun journey. There are 14 of us, 14 co-authors, and all of us represent different fields. We are not all healthcare professionals. However, all of us have been affiliated or associated with the Arkan University at some point or another. So we do link up with healthcare, even if our primary area of concentration or discipline was not healthcare. But we represent fields as diverse as IT, business, engineering, biomed engineering, and so on and so forth. Walid happens to be here as one of the panelists, and he's one of the co-authors. And this book is consists of 10 chapters, and each of those chapters is meant to be one of the spokes of CCIT. So it's a hub and spoke model where the hub itself is CCIT. It's powering the spokes, and the first chapter is what we are starting a conversation with today. So I'm not going to tell you a lot of detail about the chapter, but it's really setting the stage, hence the name, setting the stage. It sets the stage or set the tone for CCIT a long time ago, and Walid will help us kind of understand some of that through the Q&A. Okay, so chapter 2 is on Ignite sessions, and I saw Sarosh is also one of our, Sarosh, and I don't know if Mariam is also here, but Mariam and Sarosh were co-authors for Ignite, and at some point we're going to get them involved in our webinar sessions as well. Chapter 3 was about hackathon experience at and past AKU. Chapter 4 was about incubating, really early stage business incubation for the startups or the startup culture at AKU. Chapter 5 is about narrative medicine. It's a very interesting area. Chapter 6 delves into innovation fellowship iterations of ours. So next year it'll be a third iteration of the innovation fellowship. Chapter 7 is specifically on COVID-19, but not just any kind of innovation, but jugaad innovation, just fast and frugal innovation, and how have we defined jugaad innovation for ourselves and put together processes for COVID-19 specifically. Chapter 8 is text linked to innovation. One could always argue that because Farhana is our speaker for today, we could have had chapter 8 as the entry point, because that does delve into data science, AI, machine learning, and so on, and how does that link up to low-cost innovation. But you'll understand why Farhana makes a very good person for a panel for chapter 1 as well. Chapter 9 and 10 are kind of putting all these things together. So chapter 9 delves into going past health and disease towards humanities, social sciences, arts, and so on, and how we have started looking at innovation and incubation through a sector agnostic lens, so different verticals. And then chapter 10 is about innovation for life by utilizing a lot of different contemporary philosophies and how they link up with innovation and entrepreneurship. Anyways, okay, so very quick introduction to the chapters, and this is just a sneak preview. This is what the digital book, some of the illustrations, and it's colorful, and even the print copy looks like that. And here's another sneak peek, and we're done with my PowerPoint slides. Okay, so that was my really quick introduction to the book, and I wanted you all to take a look at the book, medjack.net. Please read about our book, and if you're interested, reach out to us, and we'll be really happy to involve you in a discussion as well through the MEDJACK webinar series. Right, let's get to our speakers. Okay, so the format is what Marine has already gone over. We're going to get into a very interesting discussion, and if you put your comments or your questions in the chat box, and I'll be happy to kind of go into those questions and comments versus continuing my own spiel. Okay, so feel really comfortable, and no question or comment is a stupid question or comment. Yeah, definitely not. Okay, so Walid, let's start off with you, okay? And you were the co-author, you were well, not the co-author, you were the solo author of chapter 1. And it was a strategic move from my perspective. I would have made you write all 10 chapters had it been up to me. You weren't in Karachi then, it's too late. So anyways, chapter 1, it was for you. And so, it starts off with setting the stage, setting the tone. Why did we go about putting together CCIT? So from Skunkworks to where CCIT is now, why don't you tell our viewers about CCIT's journey through your lens, so to say, and feel really candid. And you have 2 minutes. No, just joking. Yeah.
That's a pretty loaded question. I think, the journey has been incredible. There's really nothing else to say for it. I think what was very interesting from the get-go was the perspective that the team had. Was a perspective that it was pretty much a fresh perspective that we hadn't seen in medical education before. Solving things was not really one of the major things we were taught in medical school. We were taught how to learn, but never how to think. So I think this forum was the first place where I personally felt comfortable throwing out my wild, crazy ideas and seeing what happens, what sticks, what doesn't work, and then reiterating as we go, obviously. But just providing that platform was, for me at least, very helpful. And, that's how I got involved with CCIT, became the first hire, and then obviously the rest is history. I spent almost close to 3 years working with the team, growing it to where it is now. And I'm personally very proud of that, achievement, and proud of the team that is looking after the projects now. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but obviously there's a few more questions down the road, so I'll save some time on this one.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you for keeping it succinct as well, because I think for the follow-up questions will probably kind of like take us back to that particular question, and you can probably dissect it further. So just as one of the follow-up questions to that, you started off, I believe, 1 or 2 years before even graduating, because you're volunteering for some of the events and activities, and at that stage, CCIT was pretty much voluntary initiative. Students were volunteering the time. I was also volunteering my time. It was a lot of fun working with the younger lot. You guys, you folks ask me questions which I'm unable to answer and address, but so it's been a lot of fun from that perspective. But then it started formalizing as well, and then you saw that formalization process, and then you exited. You were kind of like a startup of ours that exited. So you are the startup that exited. And I don't know whether you've kind of gone IPO as yet, you as an individual. But Walid, so tell me where you're at now. How do you think that CCIT experience or journey has informed what you're doing now? How do you connect? Do you look at, because you're a research manager, do you have a different take on things because you've done this innovation and entrepreneurship bit over the past few years?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think all of us that have been through CCIT almost have a way of thinking which is different from how normal researchers would think. So even in my current role as research manager at Cornell, I am looking at research fairly differently and in a very exciting way. I'm looking at new tech and how we can use technology to make things better. So from every big company to every small company, we're engaging with them, be it big tech like Apple, be it smaller companies, startup companies that are just starting. I'm personally reaching out to and engaging all of them. And all of this comes from our CCIT time, where we understand the need for not just technology, but just process improvement from the get-go, and creating really impactful research, as opposed to, there's obviously research is pretty broad and you can have a lot of ways to conduct research. But my interest has primarily been outcomes-based, tech-based implementation research, and I think that's what I've carried from my CCIT time, and I hope to kind of make it my niche going forward as well.
Great, thank you, Walid. I do appreciate the succinct answers, because I have some really interesting, follow-up questions just to kind of help our younger folks try to understand, because I think a lot of them do struggle with giving up, kind of quote unquote, although I don't feel it's really giving up on clinical medicine when you're jumping from, after having done 5 years of MBBS, and then you don't pursue clinical medicine and you do something like innovation and entrepreneurship, and then so I think what you're making the case for is that, this is all incremental, and it does add value, it brings value, and then you can take a look at things very differently because of your innovation and entrepreneurship lens. So I'll come back to that, because I find that really interesting. So Farhana, let's get you into this conversation. So Farhana, you also got to read the chapter, and the way that the chapter kind of sets the stage. We did not have any official or formalized processes. We did not have. I'm a clinical researcher, so that's a tried and tested kind of a strategy, right? So years of clinical research and bench work before that. So no SOPs were provided to CCIT or a manual. Okay, here's how you are going to put together your innovation or incubation hub, and this is how you're going to go forth. So none of that, and we didn't even understand the words and what do they mean. Yes, we read the definitions, but if you you being the chief data innovation officer, and your take on data science, big data, and so on. How would you have advised us if had we come to you at that stage and had asked you or spoken to you about putting together an innovation hub? Would you have told us to kind of do things very differently, or not so very differently? And so what would you have advised us, and why so? But do look at it through the data lens, because we did not actually give a whole lot of importance to data from the get-go. And so I would like you to, take us through that thought process. Thank you.
So I think you ask a very interesting question, right? So there isn't a single recipe for innovation. There isn't like, in order to have the end result being innovation, you need 2 cups of flour, 1 cup of applesauce, et cetera, et cetera. There isn't one. There is many different recipes for innovation. And it actually very much depends on a couple of items. So one is, what's the market ecosystem that you're operating in? The second is the culture, which that is one of the key drivers of how innovation can progress. And so, at that point, like depending on how AKU looks at innovation from a cultural perspective, it being very health-centric, you've also got 6 different countries, so you've got 6 different types of cultures. All of those need to be taken into consideration. When you think about data to me is absolutely one of the ingredients, right? Because what it enables you to do is do fact-based decision-making, right? You're able to look at the data, and it can drive, depending on the outcomes that you want to achieve. I 9,642% agree with Walid in terms of the outcome-based approach. We need to understand, so what was the purpose of this incubation innovation hub? Was it to drive outcomes in healthcare that were low cost, et cetera, right? And so when I look at some of the common ingredients that you have for innovation, data is one of them. Diversity is also another key ingredient, right? And if you look at the team that you put together, yes, you had healthcare professionals, but you also had engineers, you had people from IT, and that perspective is usually one of the main ingredients that people forget about in innovation. And so I did spend my last decade working in startup world, so Silicon Valley, and that is the one thing that startups do put a lot of emphasis on, is diversity of thought. They put it specifically into their hiring practices, when they create teams, etc. So for example, on my last team, I worked at a company called Shopify. I had a film designer on my team. And you're thinking, I'm building software. Why do you have a film designer on your team? And the reason I had that is because I was delivering analytics to merchants, right? And what we had is a very wide spectrum of users. And film designers are actually quite good at how they put out ideas in a manner that people can absorb them. And so therefore, that was the diversity of thought that we needed. The two other ingredients that I think are quite important are pragmatic execution. You can't think about it in terms of, listen, we need to have this big bang approach. Everything needs to be perfect. You need that agility. And last but not least, which you had a lot of, led by yourself, Asad, is a very, very strong dose of evangelism. You need to talk about it. There needs to be a constant drumbeat, and those become some of the key ingredients, including data, for innovation.
Great, thank you. So in other words, you passed us, right? So you wouldn't have done things differently,
No,
or not too differently. Okay.
No, I don't think so. Right? Like the only part I would have potentially, like you used agile. Maybe there was more different ways to use agile. Technology was an enable. You focused on outcomes. I think what you did was fantastic in terms of driving and pushing the ball forward.
Great, that's really good to know, because I guess after years of doing this, several years of doing this, we've also published original research, biomedical papers. So some of the criticism we used to get was that, well, okay, this is all very good, but what's the evidence, or where's the data that this actually is working and this is having impact? And so you're kind of being forced back into the box of traditional, in my opinion, traditional clinical research study or research study design, because then you can't have the same metrics, if I may. And so that constantly going back and forth. And I, like I said, I'm a clinical researcher, so I've also had to kind of stop thinking through the same lens of clinical research study design for these kinds of things. And so so how important do you think is, so you mentioned culture, and culture is really, really important, but when you say culture is important, Farhana, so how are you defining culture in this case?
So the way I'm defining culture is openness to new ideas, openness to not doing things the same way that they were done before, right? And there's different ways to address that. So in my past experiences, what has really worked effectively for me is to be very fact-based, right? I'm a female in tech, right? When I started in tech, and I'm not going to tell you how many years ago that was, let's just say there weren't many females in tech. And so therefore, there were some gender biases, et cetera. And so therefore, ensuring that I always presented factual evidence was what got me along the long way. But how you present that also depends on the culture. And so I'll give you one story. So the last organization that I worked at, right, very millennial driven organization, and very much we like to build things from scratch. So there was a proposal for a design, right? And based on my experience, it was a data architecture that wasn't going to scale. I could tell you within the first 5 minutes, because in general, data architectures have new technologies. However, the underpinning or the key principles have not changed for over 50 years. However, this was a team where me telling them that it was going to fail was not going to work, because it was a bunch of engineers and they were like, you're not an engineer, traditionally in their mind. So how do I get across using facts that this wasn't going to work, but they need to come to that conclusion, right? So there was innovation that needed to happen. We were putting in a new data architecture. We just couldn't go down that route. And so the principle that I approached it with was a fail fast principle. We put in 3 sets of sprints, 2 weeks each. At the end of each sprint, we evaluated what that architecture was. After 6 weeks, they concluded this isn't going to work. We need to look at different approaches. But what they did is we learned along the way what were some of the key outcomes we wanted to enable. which lent us to a different direction, which is where we needed to go. So the thing about culture is it depends on the organization that you're working with and how open they're going to be to change. So now this is a startup with a bunch of super smart people. We've got the diversification, we have the diversity, they're engineers, etc. But they weren't open to change because it wasn't their own. It wasn't their own idea. So how do you address it? So that's what I mean by culture. And you have to then weigh the pros and cons of how you do that. If I had pushed with my idea, it would have gone through, but at the same time, I wouldn't have a whole team supporting it. And that wasn't going to get anything done. So it's about thinking about what is the outcome you want to achieve, and then what's the best way about going to do it. And my personal bias is using facts to drive us to that conclusion.
Great, thank you. That was really good. That was really helpful as well. So Farhana, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. So Walid, in the chapter that you drafted, you make the point that innovation is the holy grail for medicine or medical disciplines. Now, my question to you is that when you say that, are you intending that to be more of a case for LMICs like Pakistan, low middle income countries like Pakistan, or you think that's a global phenomenon? And how would you, and now that you've been working in the US for a few years, how do you see this? Has your opinion or has your thought process changed?
I personally think it's a global phenomenon. I think the way it's implemented and the need and scale of it might be different, but at the end of the day, everybody needs to be innovating, be it high income countries, be it low middle income countries, really. I don't think it matters. The innovation that you would have in high income countries tends to be slightly more different, tends to be faster, tends to be smaller, tends to be incremental, and not majorly disruptive. Whereas, in lower middle income countries, you have the opportunity to leapfrog, so you can really make some aggressively disruptive, innovative changes and measure those over time as well. So I personally think it's global, but I'm happy to discuss otherwise.
Okay, no, that's fine. So you're thinking that you're saying that it's a global thing, and so it doesn't really matter whether you're from a low middle income country or a high income country. It's equally applicable. Perhaps the methodology might be different, which I think that actually piggybacks onto a good question for Farhana. So Walid mentioned leapfrogging of technology, and so there are these phrases such as trickle up innovation, reverse innovation, bottoms up innovation. I don't know. So so Farhana, how have you looked at all of these different methodologies, and what would be your recommendation for us working in low resource settings? Should we be working more on a certain type of innovation thought process?
So I think, to piggyback off Walid's point, in low middle income countries, the innovation is focused around how, because of the resource constraints that we have or the boxes that we need to operate in, how can we deliver the same outcome that high income countries can with a lot more resources, right? And in high income countries, the innovation happens all around cost efficiency usually, right? So there is innovation when there's like a wedge in the market. So people are looking for a wedge in the market. So if you look at, what Tesla did, what Uber did, et cetera, it's the same, but they're going after it in a different manner, right? But the outcome is still the same, versus we want the same outcome, but with a set of different constraints that we have. And so therefore you do get the concept of leapfrogging. So if, in the book, we talk about, in East Africa, in terms of telecom, they skip the landlines, et cetera. You also now see that data has become a key part in low middle income countries in terms of how you leverage it. In fact, we, the Aga Khan University, we announced yesterday a very large grant that we won, the NIH grant. It's the first grant, an NIH grant that we've ever won. It's $6.5 million US, and it's specifically focused on establishing a data foundation, a data research hub, a data science hub, because we know in order to address some of the concerns and the challenges that are going on in East Africa, in Kenya specifically, traditional methods aren't going to work because you're never going to have the resources, right? So, to answer your question, I don't think there's a methodology concept, like the methodologies aren't going to be different. It's the focus is going to be different in terms of what you want to achieve.
Great, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. Anil had a question over there. I think we've got a few questions coming up now. So Anil is asking for the non-MEDJACK. Please help us define the parameters for what we mean by innovation in medicine. Walid, do you want to kind of tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's as easy to define innovation as it is to define, pretty much anything else that's brought under the sun. It encompasses so much that you essentially cannot define it in a few words, but I'll still try. So for me personally, innovation in medicine is taking medicine at what it is today and making sure the medicine that we have tomorrow is better. It can be slightly better, it can be drastically better, but just constantly evolving, constantly iterating, constantly making sure that we're heading along at least a different path. For better or for worse is something that eventually still needs to be decided. But this constant evolution for me is how I would describe innovation.
Okay, great. And so just medicine becoming better, right? So I would say, yes, same, faster, cheaper, more efficient, and better outcomes, all of that. Farhana, would you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's exactly like innovation in general. So whether it's in software, whether it's in, solar technology, et cetera, it's a better way of achieving the outcome. So it's either a new approach, a novel approach that's either going to, save money, it's going to be more efficient, it's going to be more effective, or the outcome is going to be better, right? And it can be small or big. But that same definition, I think, applies to any industry.
So Anil has a follow-up comment, and that's interesting because he's talking about innovation and development in the development sector, perhaps, or in development discourse, which tends to be more incremental change versus wholesale reform. So maybe that's kind of referring to disruptive innovation versus perhaps through another perspective. So Walid and Farhana, do you think that when we talk about medicine and we're looking at outcomes, and it has to be a better medicine, as Walid puts it, then should we then constantly be looking for or focusing more so on disruption? Because that will be the kind of innovation more likely to lead to more significant outcomes. In my opinion, at least that's what I've read, versus, small changes, incremental changes, and you might not see a huge change within the life cycle of the technology itself, because the technology is probably going to change in that through the small increments. What do you think?
I can take a stab at that first. I think medicine's fairly unique. Creating a massively disruptive innovation in medicine comes with its own barrage of issues. So I would probably take majorly disruptive medical innovation with a pinch of salt. I think for medicine itself, I would personally bet my money on small incremental changes over time. The big changes will happen. EMR was one of them, but it just, because of medicine dealing with patient data, dealing with confidentiality, dealing with patient lives, it tends to be a very tricky position to work on anything really. Even big tech shies away from health tech, and just the scale at which these two ecosystems operate is also very, very different. So I think for me personally, I would prefer if it's smaller, incremental, but I really do wish we had more disruptive big changes, like you said, because I think that's what gets noticed, and that's what makes you the big bucks.
Yeah, my my 2 cents on this, and not being from the medical field, is, similar to what Walid said, in that in medicine, unlike potentially other areas, there isn't always a single right answer. And so when there isn't always a single right answer, there's a multitude of factors that need to be taken into consideration. Those are very hard when you think of large disruptive, right? So for example, Uber was a big disruption, right? However, the objective is to get from point A to point B. It's a pretty concrete path in terms of how you get there. What they changed was how you get there, like in terms of how you solicit a car, how payment is made. But A to B is you want to improve the patient's health. However, there's different factors, and because it is a system, other things can get out of whack. And so therefore, it is hard for major disruption, right? And even when you think about the EMR, EHR, whatever you want to call it, right? You still always had records. What you were now doing is you were just digitizing the records, right? So it was more of a digital transformation. There wasn't, in most cases, a huge process change, et cetera. So there wasn't that large disruption, because it's hard in healthcare. But there's a lot of value to be had in small and incremental approaches, where we talk about the iterations, we talk about the feedback loop. The feedback loop is very important in healthcare, because you need to understand whether that outcome or that impact is positive. And so you need to allow for that feedback loop. In large disruptions, it's hard to measure the feedback loop and the impact of it. So therefore, you need the smaller ones. A really good example is right now the controversy around the eGFR, the thing that measures how effectively your kidneys are, disposing of waste. So ever since the start of time, right, there's a different calculation done for Black people, taking muscle density into mass, right? But there was no factual evidence. It was just, hey, listen, they have more muscle density. We need to take that into consideration, which meant that a lot of people that were Black, right? There was 2 calculations, you're either Black or not Black. There's different shades of gray in between. And so that is a potential where even a small, I'm not going to call it innovation, but a change in thinking, right? So you are doing something new. It's not super disruptive, could have a huge impact in terms of changing that way of thinking. So just an example in that area.
No, that's great. Thank you. Those are really good examples, and the EGFR. I think that kind of really hammers the point home as well. Where you're talking about like a process or small change, right? So although we would want to see bigger things, but I'm completely with you on this. That smaller iterations don't get noticed as much as the bigger, huge disruption. But it's those smaller ones, I think, that make much more of a difference than that one big thing. I don't know. I know Walid mentioned money as well. So the money talks and the rest walk. But I don't know. What's your take on investments, right? So we might be going off a bit on a tangent here, but I think it's important because ultimately, the holy grail, if I may, is really having a budget so that you can keep doing these processes of innovation and incubation and creative thinking and whatnot in a medical institution. So Farhana, from your perspective, right? So just because bigger things get noticed, should one be then following on those or trying to get that bigger thing, whether it's money or grant or disruption, so that it gets noticed and you're able to sustain? What do you say to that?
So I think the one thing when it comes to innovation or healthcare tech is, so I just looked at the numbers recently for something else. So investment in venture capital is actually up 23% year to date, so in 2021. than it was in 2020. And 2020 was like a year, like it was a huge year for VC investment. What's really interesting is the three areas that are key investment areas. There's e-commerce, just because of the pandemic, it's driven a lot of e-commerce. The second is healthcare tech, and then fintech, right? And in healthcare tech, so I sit as an advisor on a bunch of AI companies, like incubate startups, right? But I work with a couple of VCs, and it's very interesting to see how and where they are making investments. So a couple of items. So one is within North America, the investments are primarily focused on expense reduction, right? Because if you look at healthcare costs in high income countries, right, they're growing at a much faster pace, in some cases 2 to 3 times higher than GDP. And so therefore that creates a huge, huge concern. And so what you see is within current settings is how do you reduce that cost? And this is where I think from a low middle income country perspective, some of the innovations that we bring to bear have a huge impact. We all know that the health of a person isn't just based on medical determinants. Social and mental determinants play a much, much, much larger factor, right? And so one of the things I think low middle income countries do, because we, from a research angle, is we don't just look at the medical determinants. We look at the social and the most often social and sometimes we take into consideration mental determinants. And so therefore, a lot of the innovations that we come up, the findings that we come up with are of interest. And so what you now see is investments that are looking for different regions in terms of where, are these new innovations. And I think that is an opportunity for us in low middle income countries to go after that money, because that's a different type of money, right? It's a money that if you prove to be successful, it continues and it becomes a continuous stream that hopefully also leads to, a revenue base.
Great point. Thank you for that. I hope people keep that in mind. So, but that is a really important point. Anil has put another really interesting comment over there, a question. So I would just encourage people to kind of read that. But if you have time, we can get to that as well. So Walid, based on your experience of being part of this at a very early stage, do you think what we were doing or CCIT did at that time, or perhaps is still doing, is redefining leadership through team dynamics or relevant team dynamics? And if you could kind of comment on that, or what are your thoughts about that? How is that different from what exists in other places or in other departments, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one basic principle that worked for CCIT was that we were transgenerational and non-hierarchical. I think at the end of the day, if people can question the leaders, I think that's where the real magic happens. Because at the end of the day, if one person says something and everybody else knows it's wrong, but still nods and goes along with it, I think that's going to cause a lot of issues going down the road. And that's exactly what startups do now. There is no hierarchy. Everything's questioned. Everybody is questioned, and it's all with good intent. Nobody does it out of malice. It's all done because the team believes in progressing together, and you can't do that unless you critically think, unless you critically question and evolve. So I think that was a major learning for me personally from CCIT, and I think that's carried forward. I mean, I hope to carry forward throughout my life, just questioning, not questioning authority, but questioning and really being open to raising my questions or raising my concerns if and when they do arise, and not shying away from the fact.
If I can add.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Like what Walid said there is key, right? Like the reason that startups have been so successful in the shorter amount of time relative to enterprise companies is exactly that. And that was my biggest observation. And I call it, everyone needs to think like the boss, right? Like you are all leaders in this organization. And so you don't have to wait. If the trash needs to be taken out, take out the trash, right? Like nobody's going to tell you to take out the trash. if a problem needs to be fixed and you have a good solution, it might not be your swim lane, but propose the solution. In terms of the questioning, it's exactly that. It's not a questioning of authority. I'm not being disrespectful, but I'm asking a question. And to be honest, if you can't provide me a valid answer, then you potentially might not have thought it through. And so don't think of this as me calling something out, but it's like, hey, we need to think this through because we haven't defined the problem properly. We're not clear on what the outcome is. Our solution might not be as foolproof, etc. And it's that which has, like, you know, you look at the markets and you see the progress that has been made by startups, right? You know, their one advantage is that they are not stuck with, you know, lots of, I'm going to call it legacy type of systems. Absolutely an advantage. But this, in terms of the thinking, the trust battery that gets established, has been a fundamental driver in terms of the, not only the innovation, but the types of results they've been able to achieve.
Thank you for that, Farhana. So I think, you know, at times I've also kind of wondered, and that maybe what a small hub or Skunkworks, I mean, Carl calls it the Skunkworks, but it's almost like a microcosm, and then perhaps, you know, it's something that others could also kind of take a look at in terms of processes and or the organogram or the lack thereof. It's non-hierarchical from that perspective, and even within CCIT, it's been interesting for Anna that, you know, we've kind of gone back and forth. So Walid was part of it at a different stage, and then there've been people who've come on board at a different stage, and then people have left, and so, you know, it's tweaking ourselves depending on circumstances and how hierarchical or non-hierarchical one needs to be, because if you are completely non-hierarchical, then you might not be able to get certain things done. At least that's also felt at times. Yeah. And in your own team, do you think that with your own team currently or in the past, how have you managed that?
So I'm not abolishing hierarchies. That's not, but the thing is, it's the thinking around how the team works, right? So for example, like on my team, if somebody wants to call me out in terms of, hey, you didn't think through that, I have two choices. I can take it as, oh my God, I can't believe you said that to me. I'm the boss. How dare you say that to me? Or I'll be like, oh, you know what? You're right. I made a mistake. So I'll give you an example. I'm helping a certain team right now build an analytic system, right? Within that team construct, right, we're enabling something. I made a mistake. Like I actually went and I did something, and we were on a call and we're having this conversation, and this person was upset that I had done this thing, but they were afraid to tell me that, hey, listen, you did this thing, because they're in fear of that, you know, I'm the lead, right? And so I called it out to hopefully set the example of, no, I made a mistake, right? This is what I did. I won't do it in the future. But then I also, in front of the whole team, said, the next time you need to call me out, because I'm never going to learn. It depends on the mentality. It's not about abolishing the hierarchy, but it's the approach that you take in terms of, it's not personal. Like most often in hierarchies, what happens is it gets taken personally. And that is what is something that needs to get avoided. It's not personal. It's about moving the organization forward. And as long as you offer constructive feedback in a manner that isn't personal, usually that works.
Thank you for that. Farhana, just based on your experience, because you worked at different companies, have you come across a model of the kind in which a small hub, well, similar to what we've been, I guess he said, even when you have, it's a huge organization, but it's just a few people that are doing things very differently, and it doesn't necessarily get you know, scaled up from that perspective. And one, I mean, it's just a part of our thing was that, you know, we want to change mindsets, but then over several years, we don't know how do we measure that, even like have we really changed mindsets in terms of numbers, but we do feel that we've had impact, but perhaps not from the numbers of people and changing their mindsets, because they still tend to be traditional and hierarchical in their thought process. But in your past life, do you think that's happening in other companies where a small hub or small group remains and sustains itself through by being mavericks around it, perhaps?
So, you can see there's a trend, right? And I actually participated in quite a few of them. So I used to work for enterprise companies, right? So I worked for IBM, I worked for a company called SAS. And one of my roles in those companies was actually working in the startup or the incubate unit where we had to think differently, right? The first one I did was, I want to say way back then, when the internet was invented, right? So now that tells you how old I am. But, we got an office, we got this cool furniture that you can roll around in and stuff like that, thinking that, okay, and it was to set the mindset of this team is going to be different, right? The good thing about that is you get to operate in this framework, you get to think differently, you get to move things, and you don't have all of the constraints that you have in the enterprise company. But the question comes to scaling, like how do you scale it? And so what I've observed, because one of my roles has always been like taking these incubate businesses and growing it out, is there's two ways. So you either have people out of that organization move into other parts of the organization so they can bring that type of thought, or like we talked about before, that very strong dose of evangelism using proof points in terms of the value. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of parroting, right? You feel like a parrot, you continue to repeat it over and over again. And depending on the leadership and the openness to it, then that's a way to bring that mindset to other parts of the organization. Or you get acquired and then the other company notices it and it puts you at the forefront. So those are sort of the three ways that I've seen it happen.
Oh, great, thank you. We'll keep all of those in mind. Perhaps we'll get acquired. Who knows? So I'm still waiting for more questions and comments. Anil's question is still there. So if either of you wants to kind of comment on that, and we could, we've got another like 5 minutes or so, but people who are still on this call, if you have any questions or comments, or you'd like to say something, feel free, let us know. Otherwise I'll keep asking questions. So Walid, let me ask you, so you went to med school for 5 years, you got your degree, and then and when you were coming on board, first hire for CCIT. So how did you have to explain to your family, or did they ask difficult questions, or did your friends, loved ones, better halves give you a hard time?
I mean, I think everybody can tell what the answer would be. Yeah, it wasn't easy. I mean, even to date, I think I still struggle with scoring well on that traditional scale where medical graduates will go into residency, and I see all of my colleagues getting into fellowships now. And for me, I'm personally okay with that, because I think I'm at a stage in my life where I can do a lot more than what I intended to do. So for me, it was all about scale. For me, it was all about change. And that's what I've made my life. But oh, no way was it easy. I think I get questioned every day, if not every week. And there's always somebody telling me I'm wasting my life. It's significantly more difficult in Pakistan, just because I guess nobody's done it. Here in the US, you see people with dual degrees all the time. I mean, after medicine, it's pretty much an open field. You can do whatever you want, and the opportunities are really, really open here. So it's a different environment here in the US, but it still doesn't make it any easier for a medical graduate to just completely skip out on clinical medicine altogether.
It's interesting because in tech, actually having a degree goes against you. So now in software, we don't actually look at degrees and things like that when you're hiring. Like what you're looking at is at potential. It's just it's a different world. So yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point. Walid, Sarosh is asking you, why did you start CCIT with students rather than professionals within AQ?
I love working with students. I think there's, it's something about that age, it's something about that energy. They're just, they're usually in that one spot just ready to burst out, and they're a lot of them are looking for a way out as well. So I think for me to recruit people like Sarosh was a great learning opportunity for me myself. I think finding people that are equally excited about innovation, that are equally interested in questioning status quo is really difficult. And for me, that was, within the student bank, finding one or two students, not too many. But it's been very fruitful.
Great. So Heba is asking, perhaps Farhana, you could take this one. What are some of the initiatives you have taken to bring about innovation in medicine?
So specifically in medicine, I only had one role. So I used to work for IBM Watson, which is the artificial intelligence arm of IBM, but specifically focused initially on healthcare. And like I said before, is, the overall health of a person is not just based on medical determinants. And so one of the things that a piece of software that I had built very early on was one that took into consideration not just the health determinants, so we would pull in all of the health determinants from the EMR, but we also had all of the social determinants, usually coming in from a social care worker, and we built the software for vulnerable population. So vulnerable population, think of it as an aging population where you want to think about how do you take care of this person overall, people that come from disparate situations, so low income, as well as those that had mental health challenges. And I would say that in high income countries, there were only certain countries that were forward thinking in this. So you can think of the Scandinavian countries. So we had a lot of success there in terms of that. There was one province in Spain, so the Catalonia province was quite successful with this. And then within North America, it was primarily regions where you had large populations, where the income was quite low. So in New York City, as well as the incarcerated population in Miami. So, but the results were phenomenal, like in terms of how they were able to the focus is always lowering costs, right? Like, how do we lower the medical costs? How do we proactively prevent potential, costs down the road? And, over 5 years, it was incredible in terms of not only were the costs lower, however, what you also had was better health outcomes, or better outcomes, not even health, better health outcomes for the individuals. And honestly, it was a piece of software that just coordinated the interactions between social care workers, healthcare workers, and in some cases, mental health care, like psychologists. That's all it was. And so very small disruption, nothing rocket science, there's no AI involved. It was just a coordination thing, but it helped look at the overall perspective of the patient.
Great. I mean, I think we could certainly spend a lot more time on just talking about innovation in medicine and examples of that. And Farhana and Walid, both of you could be talking to us a lot more about it. But we're coming to the top of the hour. But Anil's point is still waiting there to be addressed. And Anil always asks such fabulous questions and puts comments in our chat boxes. So thank you for that, Anil. So let me ask both of you to kind of reflect on this, because it's medical waste is a huge issue, right? So Anil is saying that if medical waste is such a big contributor to environmental degradation and pollution, then would changing the status quo be by combining, by merging the expertise of an engineer and a medic, or a physician or nurse, and so on and so forth, and then addressing the issue of medical waste through that approach? Would that be questioning, something like that? Would that be changing the status quo? Walid, what do you think? And Farhana, both of you can help us think through.
I'm still thinking through this. Farhana, if you want to go first, please feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we start with, instead of putting the solution forward in terms of let's put an engineer together, let's put, you know, a medical physician together, somebody with a medical background, is let's just be very clear on what the problem is. The problem is medical waste, and what's the consequence of that to the environment. And so therefore, in order to address that, you start like from an innovation perspective. So you start with some brainstorming, et cetera, and then you potentially bring a group together. I'm not a big fan of prescribing what a potential solution to address that problem is until, like, let's start from first principles. That's just always like one of the advices that I always have is be very clear on what the problem is, but don't put the solution when you're defining the problem, because then what you do is you've already introduced bias, right? And honestly, it could be, it could be a refuse worker that could come up with the best solution. You don't know that, right? But you've already biased it by putting together two personalities that you think will be effective for it. That's my two.
I mean, I love that response. I don't think there's anything else I can add to it. That process really is everything, and thank you for talking us through it.
Yeah, thank you. That was really well said. And I'm just going to reiterate that, even as a Farhana, for our hackathons or our design sprints, we always tell people to focus on the problem and to define the problem, and because they tend to constantly jump towards solutions, and they already have the solution in mind, and it's going to be an app. So we're kind of like, no, don't think of the solution. Let's understand the problem. Why is it a problem, and so on and so forth. So thank you for that reminder. And I think we've kind of like, we're done with the time. Thank you so much. And really do appreciate the time that you've given to us. And for the rest of the folks, if you have questions and comments and you would like to get in touch with Farhana or Walid, I'm sure they'll be interested in, if it's okay with you, then, we can connect people to Farhana and Walid as well. And, or you can just kind of write to us, and we can kind of like, maybe we'll have a follow-up session perhaps in a few weeks or months or whatnot. So that's about it from me. Thank you once again. And all of you have a nice day, evening, morning, whatever. Have coffee.
Thank you very much.
Have coffee. All right.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.